Boa noite a todas, todos e todes. Estamos aqui nessa última sessão do dia do nosso colóquio Filósofas. É um prazer estar aqui recebendo essas convidadas. Eu sou Carolina Araújo, da UFRJ, e eu estou mediando essa mesa, e que ela tem um formato um pouquinho diferente das anteriores. O primeiro ponto é que ela vai ser uma mesa em inglês, porque nós temos uma convidada que não é lusófona, a professora Naomi Scheman. E em segundo lugar, que essa é uma mesa de um debate, ela vai ter uma forma de um debate interno, uma certa entrevista, uma vez que se trata dessa mesa, foi baseada num dos artigos do dossiê Filósofas, na verdade, é uma tradução do trabalho da professora Naomi Scheman, feita pela professora Gisele Secco e por Rafaela Vaccari. E eu passo aqui rapidamente a apresentar a nossa mesa, começando com a nossa autora, Naomi Scheman, que é professora de filosofia, gênero, sexualidade, estudos de mulheres e sexualidade da Universidade de Minnesota. Ela também é professora convidada da UMEA Center for Gender Studies na Suécia. Ela tem uma tradição, uma experiência grande em conectar a filosofia da linguagem, sobretudo a filosofia de Wittgenstein, na filosofia feminista, fazer essas interconexões e essas pontes. Ela é autora de 4 livros importantes: Engendering Construction of Knowledge, Authority and Privilege, Academic Feminism, Is Academic Feminism Bad? Feminist Interpretation of Wittgenstein, and Shifting Ground, Knowledge and Reality, Transgression and Trust. São os 4 livros dela, e nós vamos ter o prazer de ouvi-la. Eu aproveito para apresentar também para vocês Rafaela Vaccari, que é graduanda em Filosofia na Universidade Federal de Santa Maria, e também em Direito na Universidade Franciscana. Está fazendo os 2 cursos juntas e traduziu esse texto para o volume, né? E ela também apresenta a professora Gisele Secco, que é professora do Departamento de Filosofia da Universidade de Santa Maria, atua, sobretudo, em filosofia das ciências formais e filosofia da matemática, do grupo Cone-Sul de Filosofia das Ciências Formais, da Association for Philosophy, Mathematics and Practice, nas linhas de filosofia da linguagem das ciências formais, e tem trabalhado enfaticamente sobre a presença das mulheres nessas áreas, sobretudo nas áreas mais formais da filosofia, né, como a filosofia da matemática, a filosofia da lógica. Também mencionar que a professora Gisele Secco é uma das editoras do blog Unicamp de Mulheres na Filosofia e do website Lógicas Brasileiras, onde elas recuperam, centrado na recuperação da memória e do trabalho da obra das principais pensadoras brasileiras na área de lógica. Bom, essa é a nossa mesa, eu vou passar a palavra para elas e vou dizer, então, rapidamente que a mesa vai ser em inglês e, posteriormente, a gente vai tentar colocar a legenda desse vídeo, e ele vai ficar, para quem tem mais dificuldade em seguir o inglês, ele vai estar posteriormente disponível de maneira legendada. De todo modo, para as pessoas que puderem seguir, peço que sigam, façam perguntas no chat, podem fazer as perguntas em português, que nós traduzimos as perguntas em inglês, não tem problema. E também quanto à lista de presença, eu vou disponibilizar imediatamente, porque uma vez que talvez nem todo mundo possa ter acesso ao inglês, algumas pessoas podem querer assistir esse vídeo mais tarde, isso vai ser respeitado. Eu acho que eu dei... eu vou colocar também já daqui a pouco o link para o trabalho da professora Naomi, que está traduzido no dossiê, tudo isso eu vou colocar no chat. Então, eu já falei demais, deixo vocês agora com o nosso trio. Elas já têm uma interação programada, e assim que essa primeira parte terminar, eu volto com as perguntas, vocês podem deixar as perguntas no site. Welcome, Professor Scheman, Naomi, Gisele, Rafaela. The word is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's an honor really and a pleasure to host Professor Naomi Scheman here in this sort of roundtable, in this colloquium, which is a commemoration, right, of this huge, variegated and colorful volume that was recently published of the Ideação, the volume, this Brazilian journal, as you know. And I will just very briefly say a few words about how we, especially I, get in contact with Professor Naomi's work, because I think it is important nowadays in which, you know, the perspectivism and this standpoint epistemology is so spread in our country, and the idea that you must say from where you were talking. So I will say that I am speaking from a place which is the place of someone who is a specialist in philosophy of formal sciences, but recently, I would say since 2016, I've been involved with questions regarding the representation and the presence of women, especially in logic and in philosophy of mathematics, and also in mathematics. So in this sense, I came to Minnesota in 2018 to participate on this workshop on feminist philosophy and formal logic. And that was the occasion where I came to know Professor Naomi. She was participating as a sort of discussant at large in the event. I was very curious about her work. Each intervention that she was making me more curious. And then in the end of the event, I approached her and I asked her where I could find her books, especially the books that are the collections of her essays. And then she told me something like, well, it's not very hard, you know, to find it on Amazon, on YouTube. And I said, yes, you're right. And then I thought, yes, but I would like to read them now. And she sort of, I think she got it, because the next day she came with the 2 volumes, and one of them was a very generous offer because it was a volume of one of her friends in Minnesota. And I've read both books in the plane to Brazil coming back, and I was really in love with her, so much so that I got in contact with her immediately, and then we start to have this conversation. And then in 2018, when I came to Santa Maria, we started a group of translating group of texts from women philosophers. And then was the occasion when I've met Rafaela, and I told her she was already interested in questions regarding feminist epistemology. And then I suggested her to read Naomi's text, and then she just, always very interested and curious. She decided to translate the text as a way to learn better Naomi's thought, and then it was really her translation. And of course, we worked a lot together in, trying to improve here and there, and I've learned a lot more about Naomi's work, but also now we were working on Rafaela's monograph, and she's interested in Naomi's perspective regarding some points. So this is just to say that I am new in this universe of feminist philosophy and feminist epistemology, but my entrance was sort of I'm very well, accompanied by people like Professor Naomi. So now I will just give a few minutes to Rafaela to say why she is specifically interested in Naomi's work, and then Naomi will have the floor to talk to us about this paper that we have translated. Rafaela.
Thank you, Professor Naomi, Gisele, Carolina. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you, and thanks to everyone who is watching us. So in fact, I met Professor Naomi's work from Gisele, since we started translating some articles about feminist philosophy to Portuguese, and now we are starting to think about the methodological challenges of writing a history of philosophy that is inclusive with women, and also trying to connect this discussion with some topics of feminist philosophy epistemology. And so Professor Naomi's work on this subject, of course, will be very important to our research. And it is gratifying that this article is now available in Portuguese. And I believe that today we'll have a great opportunity to talk about it and also things related to it. And for my part, I think that's all for now. And I think we are looking forward to hearing Professor Naomi's speech. Thanks.
Hello, and it's wonderful to be here. And congratulations on the publication of the volume. And thank you so much, Gisele, for getting this started, and Rafaela for doing the work on the translation. It's very moving to me and exciting and wonderful to have my work moving into a different context and being taken up by people who are interested in similar things, but coming at it from different perspectives. And that's very closely relevant to what this paper and even more the work that I've done after and that I'm continuing to do. The idea that it matters where you're coming from, where you're standing, what your experiences have been, what projects you're engaged in the world. And so the idea that when my work travels into a different world, it's going to change, and it's going to be taken up by different hands and used in different ways and made part of different ways of living. And that's enormously exciting to me. And I hope that conversations will continue, and maybe even someday my coming down and engaging in the conversations in person. So what I'd like to talk about is, I don't want to go through the paper because, of course, if you're really interested in the paper, you can read it. But more talk about how I see it fitting in with the things that are most engaging me now, and I think I hope connect with things that are engaging you. The philosopher that I've probably most been influenced by is Wittgenstein. But there's somebody who's a very, very close second to Wittgenstein in terms of influencing my work, and that's Marie Lugones. And it still breaks my heart to use the past tense. She died some months ago. She was a friend, as well as being a major philosophical influence on me and on a lot of other people. She was Argentinian. Her education and her career were in the US, but she was very connected to Latin America, and increasingly, throughout her work, but very, very much within the last few years of her life, decoloniality and thinking about the decolonial. And I've been beginning to read other people other than Lugones, like Mignolo especially, and thinking a lot about what decoloniality means. And in relation to this project. And two of the themes that were very central to Lugones's work and very much influencing this paper, as well as all of my work, really, including how I read Wittgenstein. So even though I say, the most influence on me is Wittgenstein, and then second is Marie Lugones, it might have to flip because I read Wittgenstein through the lens of Marie Lugones, who, so far as I know, never wrote about him. So it's not so much that I see his influence on her. It's not that at all. It's more that if I keep her in mind and her guidance and her mind and her heart and her soul, then I read Wittgenstein differently from almost everybody else, but I think better. So anyway, one of the things that is really important in Wittgenstein in his later work is he thinks there's a problem with the problems of philosophy, that philosophers have the wrong sorts of problems. They're just going about things in the wrong sort of way. And the question is, how do you read that? Is it just that philosophers are weird? So other people think fine, but philosophers are just kind of weird. That's not very interesting. Or is it, as some people think about it, it's something about the human condition gives rise to these problems, even though they're not quite the right problems. And that's much more interesting, but I don't think it's quite right. What I think is right, and this is partly what comes from reading Wittgenstein through the lens of Marie Lugones and others, is that the problems of philosophy come about as a result of engaging in a very specific set of practices that is becoming a particular sort of person. The privileged person in what I call, and others call, Euromodernity. That is the person who is privileged, but privileged not because he, and of course it is a he, is different from everybody else, but because he's the one who gets to be generic. He gets to be the paradigm example of what it is to be human. So he's not different, it's everybody else who's different, and different is bad, right? And that creation of that kind of subjectivity requires that you push the world away. It requires autonomy, independence, a separation of one's mind from one's body, a pushing away of not only the body, but of labor, of dependency, of vulnerability, of sexuality. All of those things come to characterize the other, while the privileged self is the one who achieves, to use a term that's important to Lugones, purity, the logic of purity, and also gets to be universal because of being generic. So the individual gets to be universal because the individual is not different. And juxtaposed to that, the decolonial term is pluriversal, not universal, but pluriversal. And the importance of that, and the importance of plurality, another central theme in Lugones's work. So how did this happen? It happened, I think, because Europe came into the world. Europe is an invention. Sometimes, if you're thinking from a British perspective, Europe gets called the continent, but Europe is not a continent. Eurasia is a continent. Europe is not a continent. It's a political, cultural, social creation. And it got created fundamentally and centrally, not only, I mean, capitalism, the Reformation had to do with this, but very centrally, it got connected through colonizing and enslaving. And the subjectivity who gets to be the generic philosopher, who has the problem of philosophers have. For example, do I know there's an external world? Central problem of philosophy. Where does that get to be a problem? And how I've come to read Wittgenstein and to think in general is that these problems are the problems of colonizers and enslavers. They're the problems that come from creating a kind of self that gets to lay claim to any place in the world. So it belongs to me. It's not that I belong to it. It belongs to me because I've come and planted my flag there, right? And that other people are not those on whom I'm dependent, those to whom I'm vulnerable, those whom I love, whom I care about, whom I need, who I share a world with, who I need to trust and who I want to trust me. No, There are those I control, in many cases those I own, or if I don't own them, they're those whose labor I get to exploit. And that kind of subjectivity, which is cut off in first instance from one's own body, then from other people, then from the rest of the world, which gets to be called nature, which is this creation, something separate. There's humans and there's nature. So these are ontologically different things that were not totally entangled. So the problems that I see in that, and so in discussing what feminist epistemology is I've come increasingly to think over the years, along with many, many feminist theorists, that we cannot think gender in abstraction from other systems of domination and subordination. And sometimes that's called intersectionality. But it's the way all of these things are entangled. And so thinking increasingly for me about decoloniality and about the importance, and this is very, very much a political issue in the US now with Black Lives Matter and increasing visibility of indigenous rights movements. So thinking about what does it mean to be a person, or in my case, what does it mean to be an American, a settler colonial, in a society that's still grappling with the inheritance of slavery and the forms of anti-Black racism and subordination that were put in place to attempt to continue white supremacy after the end of slavery. Grappling with all of those things is very, very much a part of political life now. I mean, it has been always in a sense, but it's particularly acute now. And thinking about how to go on, how to become a different kind of person, how to work in coalition, a central theme for Lugones, to not to try to erase difference, not to say everybody is the same, but to say, how do we live with and through our differences? How are our differences a resource, including an epistemic resource, a resource for how we know? And this gets into the importance of standpoint epistemology, which started with Marx in pointing out that if you want to understand how capitalism works, don't ask the capitalists. Capitalists have a very, very strong investment in not understanding how capitalism works. Ask the proletariat. And then feminists said, you want to understand how sexism and patriarchy work? Don't ask men who have a vested interest in not understanding. Ask women. And then similarly, and so then the question of how to think about knowledge that comes specifically from experiences of subordination. And what is it that we can learn about the one world we all live in by acknowledging that and this is a term Lugones uses, she always puts these double quotes around it when she says we live in different worlds, because there's one sense in which it's all one world. We're all connected, and what happens here affects what happens there. But in another sense, we construct worlds through the ways that we live, the ways that we talk, the ways that we treat each other, the customs, the practices, and so on. And being able to engage in what she calls world travel, move around from one world to another. So this is part of why I'm so interested in what happens to my words when they move into another language and into another world. And in thinking about standpoint epistemology, I've increasingly been interested in theorizing vulnerability as a standpoint. That what are the epistemic resources of vulnerability? And a large part of that is the flip side. There's people working in what are called the epistemologies of ignorance. That is, how do people remain and become and remain and are stubbornly ignorant, refusing, being unable to understand the world that they're in, and how privilege makes that happen. And one way that privilege makes it happen is by making you less vulnerable. The world doesn't affect you directly because you're protected by all of these things. And that vulnerability means that the world is evident to you, that you have to know what's going on because you're not protected by all of the cocooning, all of the protection that privilege provides. And so I'm interested in how specifically vulnerability functions as a kind of standpoint, and how it helps us understand other ways of thinking about standpoint in terms of providing vulnerability, and vulnerability both as something that's true of all of us. We're all of us vulnerable as much as we're taught to pretend we're not, if we're privileged. But some of us are much more vulnerable than others, and often for reasons having to do with forms of injustice. That is, people who are economically vulnerable are so because of unjust economic and social structures. And that means that you need to figure out how the world works in order to survive in it. So that's something if people want to talk more about that. So one question about, what happens to feminism? What happens to the focus on gender? Well, one of the things that happens is that when we pay attention to other forms of power and privilege, class and race and so on, those of us who are relatively privileged women are faced with a question of where do our loyalties lie and how do we identify? And one thing we see, and you see this a lot sort of politically, for example, is relatively privileged women identifying with the men who share those privileges with them. And I think that that's morally problematic and wrong, but also self-interestedly wrong. That is, I think that it's very important for those who identify as, who think of themselves as feminists, to form coalitions with those of us who are privileged as women feminists, so who are, for example, white or have class privilege and so on, to figure out how to be in coalition with others, other women, but also men and others who do not share those privileges, and to see our fates as tied up, as entangled, as dependent on each other. And so I think that idea of the necessity to form coalitions is really important. And for relatively privileged women not to try to replicate the positions and the perspectives of the men with whom they share those forms of privilege, but rather to try to form coalition across those lines of power and privilege. So I think I'll stop there, and I think Gisele and Rafaela have questions for me, and then more questions and discussion. Gisele, you need to unmute yourself.
This is right. Sorry. I was just saying.
I know, I'm always doing that.
Yeah, it's just, it doesn't matter how many times, we're so used to. So here's one thing, we are so used to put ourselves in agreement with those with whom we feel relatively comfortable, right? You were just talking about, I think this is an urgent topic for us to discuss, about this tension that there exists between our shared vulnerabilities and the internal hierarchies that inside a group that shares some vulnerability, we in the end, we reproduce, right? So the reference to Lugonis's work is really, I think it's very significant for us here, for us to know that I already knew, but from the Brazilian public to know that you have this, the importance of her thinking for your understanding of Wittgenstein and the problems of the problems with the problems, philosophical problems. So what we prepared 3 questions. I don't know, Rafaela, would you like to make the first one for Naomi?
Thank you, Professor Naomi. It's delightful to hear talking about these important issues. It was truly inspiring. Regarding one specific topic, I would like to know, how do you see the connections between feminist epistemology and all the efforts for rewriting the philosophical canon, including the works of women thinkers?
I think these projects are wonderful and exciting. I think a couple of things. They need to be joined with uncovering and promoting and having people read and think about writings by others who have been ignored or marginalized for reasons of race and class and so on. So I think it's problematic when projects focus just on women, and they often end up being, particularly, especially privileged women. But I think that for reasons related to what I was talking about, this needs to be a broader project. The other is, very often when people engage in these projects, the work of the women philosophers that they discover and or translate or publish or whatever, look very, very much like the work of the male philosophers who were writing at that time. And that's fine. And it's not at all surprising. It's entirely possible and happens all the time for women and also people who are in other marginalized groups to engage in philosophical work that is absolutely indistinguishable from the work that that men were doing, at that time. And that's not at all surprising. There's nothing about being a woman or a man that's going to determine the kind of work that you can do. And it's important to, particularly for people who are entering the field, to be able to see that the whole of it is open to them, that they can do anything that they want, and that there isn't any way of thinking that they're unable to do, and to feel welcome and inspired, and to feel that this history gets to be their history. And that's enormously important, and it's wonderful. But the way that I have come to think about philosophy, certainly the philosophy that most matters to me, is the philosophy that starts from grounded, embodied, historically, socially, culturally located positions, experiences, and problems. And that kind of, quote, grounded philosophy, there it is going to make a difference. It is going to make a difference how you move in the world, how you experience yourself as a social being, as an embodied being, what kinds of experiences you've had. And I think, that's not something only women can do. It's not something only marginalized people can do. It's really, really important for the maximally privileged to think about that. That is, I don't have to think just as a woman philosopher. I have to think as a white philosopher, as an affluent philosopher, as a North American philosopher, and as a settler colonial philosopher. I have to think about how I am in the world in relation to other people. And I find that kind of philosophizing particularly exciting, important, useful, challenging. And there who one is and how one is in the world is going to make a difference. But it's also true that anybody, if they're allowed to and educated to and not beaten down when they try to, can think like the supposedly universal generic man and do philosophy in that mode. There's nothing about being a woman that stops you from doing that. I find it a little less interesting, but there are people who love doing that, and it's fine to do that, and it's important to be able to see that there are women doing that, and there have been women doing that.
Sure, and this is related. Well, this is the role models, right? The importance of the role models.
Yes.
For us to see that we have this representation. But maybe I would like to ask you, like to go a little deeper on this idea of the grounded philosophy, and to talk about how the challenge of the relativism. Someone could say, yes, for one part we have the philosophical canon and all this universal white men and doing stuff as they were, as you explained it so beautifully. But then when some of the projects or most of the projects of rewriting the canon, they in the end show how women were in dialogue with this man, and so of course they were in a certain sense indistinguishable. So the option would be for us to rewrite the philosophical canon, trying to find figures that were not in this dialogue, for one part, as I understand the task of rewriting the canon from this more grounded perspective. I would like for you to go a little bit deeper, because one of the dangers I see when sometimes the emphasis on the here and now and the embodied experience and so on is that sometimes people stay there. We stay discussing little things, or my perspective, your perspective, or and then we cannot build the coalitions that you were talking about. So maybe you could please explore a little bit more these tensions that we can see.
Yes. Yeah. There sometimes people will talk about diversity as though it's just an end in itself, and isn't it wonderful? And that, maybe, but I think if we're being serious, and if we're thinking, in terms of coming to know the world, not worlds, but the actual world, the world in which, for example, the climate is moving toward being uninhabitable for our species, and fires are raging out of control, and hurricanes. There's a world there. One of the things that I thought was I've found particularly useful in thinking about standpoint theory is the work of the American philosopher Sandra Harding. And she talks about something that she calls strong objectivity. And what we've been taught traditionally in philosophy, objectivity is the world is real, but the way to get to know the real world is to not be a real knower, so that the knower becomes this abstraction. The generic person who, doesn't have a gender that is male, doesn't have a sexuality that is heterosexual, doesn't have a race that is white, and so doesn't, is in all of these things, that is the one who counts as not different. And that's no actual real person. But the idea that the way that you come to objective knowledge about the world is by trying to make yourself as unreal as possible, and that we don't situate knowers and think of them as real. And so what she calls strong objectivity is, she says, you need to put the knower in the same causal plane as the known. So you have to think of knowers as real people, as socially located, historically located, embodied, dependent, and caught up in webs of relationship. And that knowing is a relationship between a real world and a real knower. And that if you take that relationship as real and serious, so that then when I discover that somebody sees the world very differently from how I do, that it looks like, you know, we're living in different worlds, and in this sense we are, but when I take that seriously and say, well, given that there is this planet that we're on together, and maybe there are political, thinking this is coalition building, there are political things we want to engage in together. What can I learn about the world, given that somebody located there sees it that way? And what can I learn about myself? Finding out how do I appear to them, let them return the gaze, which again, something Lugones talks about a lot, and how disconcerting that can be. I mean, when I'm being seen by somebody who sees me as an embodiment of white privilege, for example, ooh, ouch, but that's real. And so it's a matter of being far more realist. I mean, the traditional philosopher with traditional views of objectivity often claims they're the realists. And those of us who take plurality seriously, we're not realists. We just believe in different views. And, oh, you think that, and you think that, and I think that, and she thinks that, and so on. That's not realist. I mean, to be a realist is to take seriously the fact that because reality is so complicated, and because knowers are real and live embodied, socially inflected lives, of course we're going to see the world differently. I mean, it would be impossible for us to see it the same way. Just as, you know, the idea would be, you know, you look outside of your window and I look outside of my window and we're supposed to see the same thing? No, we're moving into winter here. You're moving into summer. We're not, you know, if we saw the same thing looking outside of our windows, we'd both be hallucinating. The only way to take seriously to be a realist is to say, if you're located differently in the world, not just physically in different hemispheres, but socially, politically, culturally, and so on, of course you're going to see the world differently. But that's something for us to understand, and something for us to grapple with, and something for us not to try to reduce it away, but to figure out what an amazing place this is, and what amazing creatures we are, that it looks like that to you and like that to me.
Beautiful. Thank you. What does it mean to see the world differently, right? Okay, so I will let Rafaela make the last question, because we had another one about standpoint epistemology, but I think you've been talking about it. So Rafaela will make a third one, then we will open to the public. Okay.
Okay, thank you. I would like to ask one more question, so Professor Naomi. It's about how you understand the relations between feminist epistemology and the pragmatic dimension of women's academic life, especially in philosophy. I mean, at the beginning of your article, you say that the number of women graduate students and professors in philosophy is quite low. And I believe you are referring to the place where you were educated and the place where you worked. And it reminded me that in 2015, Professor Carolina Araújo, who is here with us, conducted research that points out the low presence of women in master's and doctorate courses in philosophy here in Brazil. And two of the most impressive results concern the numbers of professors and students in these courses. And so, being brief, in relation to students, 72% were male compared to 28% that were female. And in relation to professors, we had 88% male compared to 12% female. And so finally, my question is, taking into account this reality, how could reflections such as the one you propose be connected into the institutional dimension of our lives, in which there are still so few women in our departments?
It's a very difficult and tricky question, because some of it is just trying to fight against the sexism that discourages, starting with girls, but certainly women, from pursuing philosophy, particularly, along with more, formal philosophy and more formal fields, including logic and so on. And so some of it is just sort of trying to fight against that, and to just make the work of women who are doing that more visible. But the other part of it is paying attention. I really know practically nothing about the specific situation of philosophy in Brazilian universities. But in the US, there's problems, and problems across the liberal arts, with a focus on what's called STEM, science, technology, engineering, medicine, I think, and toward practical things, and away from the liberal arts more generally, so including philosophy. And I think that one of the things that is important to do is to make a case for philosophy that has to do with its connection to the world outside the academy, as well as the academy itself as a place where actual people are actually working. I mean, we tend to think that there's the real world outside the university, but the university is filled with people doing all kinds of work, including, keeping the place clean and providing, food and heat for the buildings and so on, as well as secretarial and clerical work. So there's people who, and then those of us who work as faculty or as students. So, anyway, the kind of philosophy that works in coalition, so it's feminist and decolonial and anti-racist and so on, and that engages with problems that are problems faced by people outside of the academy. I mean, one of the things that, if you're teaching an introductory philosophy class, very often, what you have to do is you have to convince students to have problems they didn't come into the class with. So you have to convince them to doubt, that they have hands or whatever. So you have to, it's called motivating the problems. Now, there's another way of starting, which is starting with the problems that they already have. Problems of figuring out what happens when they come to university and the views of their parents and their communities are being challenged in a way that they're not used to. What about that? What about the problems of political life? What about the problems of race and racism? There are problems that people have in their lives. And what happens too often in philosophy classrooms is we don't pay attention to those problems. We try to give people a whole new set of problems that they didn't have and they wouldn't have had if we hadn't given them to them. If instead we start with how can philosophy be useful and helpful in not solving, but thinking about and working on the problems that people confront in their lives, then we are in a position to make a case to philosophers and to administrators who decide how many positions the philosophy department is going to have, how much funding they're going to have, and so on, that philosophy is useful and important and interesting and engaging. And so I think rather than our pleading to be treated better, to be treated more nicely, to be treated more fairly, which we ought to be, and we've got every right to be, we should go in there and say, we are your saviors. You need us. You're going down the tubes. Nobody's going to care about you. We are here to save you, philosophy, and you better wake up to that. That's what I'd suggest.
Well, I'm all for it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So may I introduce the questions in the... Let me just get the right screen here. We have some questions from the public, so I'll just introduce them and you can discuss. You're all welcome to discuss them. The first one is from Daniela Urushka. I'm sorry if I cannot pronounce your name. We also cannot think feminism outside the world of work, labor relations. I would like to hear about it if possible.
I want to say absolutely that philosophy is something we do. It's something we do as work, and we do it in ways that are entangled with and dependent on the work of other people who produce the food we eat, who take care of the buildings we work in. And I think that the way in which labor has been marginalized in the thinking of philosophy, as though philosophy is just something that some special people do just with their brains, is a very serious problem. And so, I mean, I'm not sure whether I think I'm a Marxist exactly or even what that means, but I think that labor is extraordinarily important and that we have to think about the ways in which we're dependent on people who do lots of different kind of work, as well as thinking of ourselves as workers.
Yeah, I would. This is something that we have been living in Brazil. As you know, you have the Black Lives Matter in the U.S. and now recently, we're very, as you know, a very violent country, especially against Black people. So recently, like last week, we had this horrible assassination of a Black man in a supermarket by the security people. That was like another, it was in the day of the Black consciousness in Brazil. That was very symbolically representative, you know, of this heritage we have, which is racism. And then, of course, everyone was talking about anti-racism, the necessity of it, and stuff. And then, after a few days, again, some conceptual discussions start again about intersectionality and how important it is to think one thing not disconnected with the other. Of course, class, gender, and race, color, ethnic, especially. But then, and here I think that your work is very like fruitful for us to think about these things with the idea of perspectivism, right? Because it seems to me that from your perspective, we don't need to choose between one of these categories, between gender, between class. And the reason why I'm saying this is that because something like this, when something like this happened, George Floyd's assassination or Beto assassination last week, there are some moments in which, oh no, now race is the problem. Now we need to talk about this. But then after the heat of the moment, we start thinking that again, no, but these things are not disconnected. So maybe, I don't know if we have time, Carolina, maybe you could go a little bit more into talk about that. How do you see this discussion in which there needs to be an hierarchy? You know, sometimes people that are involved with the Black movement will say, no, race is more important. And then social movements, more, you know, union stuff would say, no, class is more important?
I would want to resist the idea of a hierarchy, but it comes to the fore in the US very, very much around the white working class and the ways in which they are really suffering and are really being screwed. The way that neoliberalism has worked, the way that globalization has worked, has really made things very, very difficult for the working class. I mean, even more difficult for Black working class, but also difficult for the white working class. And the Trumpists have seized on that. And this goes back to, what happened after the Civil War, where poor white people were told, at least you're not Black. And the working class was split along racial lines, and racism was mobilized to undercut cross-race class solidarity. And white people in the US who are seeing their world changing, we're becoming a majority non-white country. Christianity doesn't have quite the same central place that it used to. Women are getting really uppity. Gay and lesbian people can get married now. They don't have to stay in the closet. I mean, their world is changing, and they're being given a story about who to blame. Blame the immigrants, so we have xenophobia, blame Black people, blame women, blame gay people, blah, 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 instead of blaming the capitalists, blaming the wealthy people who are making out like bandits. They are bandits, and they're plundering the country, and they're getting away with it in large part because they've mobilized racism and xenophobia and sexism and misogyny. They've mobilized all of these things in order to split us from each other. And that's a crucial task. So not to say which is more important, but to say we have to find a way to be in the fight together.
We have a set of questions now on the importance of Wittgenstein for the feminist investigation. This is a first one. The importance of Wittgenstein for feminist theory, and then two other ones. Professor Laurênio Sombra asks if some concepts of Wittgenstein, such as family resemblance or the critic to the one-sided diet, do they help to criticize in a critique of the dominant perspectives, unilateral perspectives? Professor Janine Sattler also adds this thing. What about hinge epistemology? Is this a Wittgensteinian concept that would help in this inquiry?
Hello, Janine. This is obviously a huge, big question. I find Wittgenstein very helpful for the way in which he can help to break the hold on us of some unexamined pictures that come in part from a one-sided diet of examples. That is, we focus on certain kinds of things and not others. That he says somewhere, it's actually in the remarks on the foundations of mathematics, that these problems didn't arise from one thing. And it's not going to be solved by a medicine invented by an individual. It's going to be solved only by a change in the forms of life, in the ways that we live. And so the idea that philosophy is something we do, language is something we do, something we use, and we use it for a range of different purposes. One of the things he says in the investigations, he says, back to the rough ground that provides friction. And that post-structuralism in the academy was anti-foundationalist, which is great, but it led to people being kind of allergic to the notion of ground and certainly to truth, reality. We can't talk about those things. But the notion of ground became something we weren't supposed to talk about because it was taken to be foundationalist. And back to the rough ground is anti-foundationalist. It's as anti-foundationalist as you can get. Foundationalism is ignore the surface, dig down till you can ground yourself in bedrock that's not going to move, that's not going to change. And this verticality, it's either down there or it's up there. Up there is God. And the ignoring of the horizontal. The rough ground is on the surface. The rough ground, it's not foundational. It's pay attention to where you are, to what you do, to how you're connected with other people, with other places, with other things, and really break the grip of this idea that if we're going to be able to be serious, it has to be up there or down there, and pay attention to, to what's in front of your eyes. I mean, he says that, the problem is not somewhere else. The problem is here. And the reason we have a problem with it is we think it can't be this. This is too trivial. This is too everyday. This is too disparate. This is too different. This is not pure enough, to use the Lugones term. And it can't be what we're looking for. And he wants to say it is what we're looking for. We are what we're looking for. And it's those sorts of moves that I find very, very helpful. I know a little bit about hinge epistemology, not as much as I should. I'm going to be learning a bit more about it. I'm not certain where I'd want to go with that. I think the things that I find in Wittgenstein are somewhat different, but there may be important connections, and it would be interesting to find out more about that.
A last question from Professor Anna Heger-Schmidt. Would you say that feminist epistemology is to be taken as a field of research in itself, with its own subject, method, and problems, or rather as a tool to correct biased epistemology as a necessary theoretical complement?
I'm not sure exactly how to answer that. That is, it's complicated, and it gets into the question of the pragmatics of how the field is organized. That is, I think that it's important to have feminist philosophy, or even, feminist epistemology, feminist ethics. I mean, I do feminist metaphysics as well as epistemology, to have those as designated areas, in part so that when people are looking for whom to hire, they hire somebody who actually does that, and that it's important to name it as a field. On the other hand, I think that it's not just this one thing which is different from what people do there. That is, we want to say, oh, wait a second, what you're doing over there is problematic. And we want to be able to, sort of move around and make distinctively feminist or decolonial or anti-racist or whatever interventions into what everybody else is doing. And so in that sense, we want to say feminist perspectives, decolonial perspectives, anti-racist perspectives, anti-ableist perspectives, that is disability-informed perspectives, and so on, belong everywhere and have something to contribute everywhere. On the other hand, I think that it's important that there be people who do that and who are hired to do that as a specialty. I mean, maybe, ideally, the idea is that those of us who specialize in it, if we succeed, we'll do ourselves out of a job. And that would be just fine. I mean, if these perspectives come to play the role I think they should play in philosophy more generally, then there won't be a room for this specialization anymore. But we're not there yet.
Well, I think it's time for us to end.
Yeah.
I'll just point out that Professor Janine Sattler is thanking you for your translation, and she will use it in her course next semester. So
thank you.
That's a message of thanks. I think people in the chat are thanking you all for the talk. It was a great talk. I don't know if you want to make a final round to say goodbye, and we are finishing.
I would like to say thank you very, very much, Naomi. You see, your text traveled and already landed on Janine's syllabus. So that's, I think that's the idea, right? That we discuss more. And yeah, so just, it's interesting that your last topic was connected with what we were just discussing in the last session. So I think also that it fits it very well with this day here. So thanks for the organizers, presence of Rafaela here, and I hope that this is just the first of many other occasions in which we will be able to talk and to learn more.
Thank you very much. It's been delightful being here with all of you, and thank you. And on the notes that I got in the question of introducing me to the work of Jamila Ribeiro, which looks very, very interesting. And so I look forward to more connections, and thank you. And thank you, Gisele and Rafaela, for making it possible for my work to move into your world.
Nós terminamos aqui, então, o dia de hoje. Nós esperamos todos amanhã de manhã, recomeçamos às 8h30, um dia cheio de sessões. Obrigada pela presença de todos. Boa noite. Thank you all, Naomi, Gisele, Rafaela, and we end here. Bye.